Hi everyone. In this lesson we're going to continue our discussion of sequencers, and we're going to do so by talking about a number of miscellaneous subjects that can just help us use sequencers in a more advanced way. So we're going to talk about cleaning up our arpeggiator that we built last time. We're going to talk about combining signals so we can send multiple signals to the same destination. We're going to talk about sequential switches and clock dividers. Those two are really big important subjects that you're going to use a lot when you're working with sequencers. Then we'll talk about bursts and Bernoulli gates. So there's a few modules I'm going to use in this lesson that we've not subscribed to before that I haven't mentioned to you in the past. I'd recommend subscribing to the AS modules. They've got some useful BPM clocks. The impromptu modules, they've got a great clock divider. I'm also going to quickly use an autodafe or autodafe clock divider. That one you might consider optional. I'm just going to use it for a quick demo. And then a burst generator from Repelzin. So go ahead and subscribe to Repelzin as well. All right, so in this patch here, I've got a sequencer that's playing a regular sequence that is running through the row 1 is running through the VCA here, which is being scaled down significantly. And then we're running that through a quantizer, which is quantizing it to a major triad. So we get this Alberti bass kind of pattern. And then that's running into my even VCO, which goes through an envelope and a VCA, and then out my mixer. And then I also have my keyboard setup going into the other volts per octave input of this oscillator so that whenever this pattern plays and I change keys on my keyboard, now you notice whenever I change keys, it's cool that my arpeggiator moves up, but I get that weird little hiccup where if I don't hit the key exactly in between steps, you can actually hear the switch from one key to the next, and it kind of creates this little skip. So there's got to be a way that we can fix that, or we can tell the keyboard to hold on to its voltage before and wait for the next step before it sends it to the oscillator. So try to think about a way that we can do that. Is there some module that can hold a voltage for a fixed amount of time before it sends it? There might be a module that even has hold in its name. And if you're thinking of sample and hold, you're right. So I'm going to go ahead and add a simple sample and hold module. And I'm going to use that utilities module from Audible Instruments. I'm going to take my volts per octave from the keyboard, send that into my sample and hold, and then send it back out to the even VCO, to the volts per octave input there. And then what do I use for my trigger? Well, I want it to line up with the steps from my sequencer. So I'm going to use the gate from my sequencer, the gate output, to trigger. So basically, every time I press a key, that voltage is going to go into sample and hold, but it's only going to be let out whenever the trigger from the gate happens. And so now whenever I let this play and change keys, you can hear I don't have any of those hiccups. It's all switching really, really cleanly. So that's a handy way if you wanted to build an arpeggiator, that you can design that arpeggiator and have it line up with your keyboard so you're not getting those strange hiccups. All right, so here's a patch that's really similar to one we looked at last time, where I've got a sequence going. It's row 1 is running through a VCA, which is scaling it down, running it through a quantizer, which quantizes it to a major scale. That goes through my VCO. My VCO's sawtooth output is running through a filter and then through an EG and VCA, and that goes out to the mixer. Now I've also got the first gate from my sequence is going up and triggering a separate ADSR, which opens up my filter. So I get this thing like we saw in that Moog demo video last time, where every time the first step happens, it opens up that filter. and that filter will open up quickly. I've got some attack and some release, so it's going to open up and then close, and it's going to remain closed for the rest of the steps. So that's cool. That's straightforward. We know that already. But what if I wanted to have a few different steps open this filter? What if I wanted my fourth step also? Well, then I could just take this patch cord and send it up, but actually Rack won't let us do that. Rack will let us take multiple outputs, but it won't let us stack up multiple inputs. So we've got to find some way to combine this gate and this gate before we send it into this input here on the envelope generator. And there's a handy little tool we can do that. Bog Audio makes a couple of these simple little mixers. So I'm going to open one of those up. They've actually got a lot of mixers, so I'm going to click on Bog Audio and Mixer, and then you can see them all here. And we're going to pull up this little one called UMix. And UMix is a simple 8-channel mixer. It's got 8 inputs and 1 output, and you notice it has no level controls, no volume sliders, no nothing. You just send something in, several different things in, and they all come out. So we can just send our first gate up here, then take our fourth gate, send that into another one of these outputs, doesn't matter which one. And I can then send those into my filters EG. So we've just added those signals together and then sent them out that gate. Now there's another module called MuMix, which is the exact same thing as UMix, except it's got a bunch of mute buttons along the side. So if we switch this over, maybe we could add a couple more. I'll just add one more for now. So then if I wanted to turn any of these off, I could just mute them. So that's also a handy tool. There's a couple other things we can do with these mixing modules. I'm going to delete that. We'll go ahead and just send our first gate directly to our filter like before. And I'm going to take this MuMix down here. And you'll notice that I'm using just the regular fundamental VCO, and it's only got 1 volt per octave input. And I've got a keyboard input here. And if I wanted to send my keyboard to this oscillator so that I had one of those arpeggiator things where I could hit a key and it changes the bass pitch of the sequence, I can't actually do that because I can only send, this is not like the Bufaco oscillator where I could send 2 different volts per octave inputs. I've only got the 1. So what I can do, though, is I can use this UMix module, send my keyboard volts per octave into that, send the volts per octave coming from the sequencer and the quantizer in as well, and then I can send that to my volts per octave, so those get mixed together. And so now when I change keys on the keyboard, and I'm getting a little bit of those skips. It's not as audible in this sequence with the filter being closed, but if I wanted to really clean that up, I could go ahead and add that sample and hold back in. And just to show you guys what exactly is going on, when I say these are getting added together, they are quite literally being added together. So I'm going to go ahead and take the output of my sequence, send that into our scope, and then I'm going to take the output, not from the keyboard, because that's going to just look boring, but I'm going to take the output from the UMix, where we've added the keyboard to our sequence. And you can see right now, because I'm sending 0 volts from my keyboard, I'm just sending middle C, that it is, both of these voltages are aligned. They look the same. But if I were to play an octave higher on my keyboard, you can see that the voltage from the sequence is there in blue, and I've added 1 to it. I've gone up an octave, and you can see now the new voltage from the sequence is an octave higher, it's a volt higher, and it's transposed up. Now it's 2 octaves up, 3 octaves. So you can see how those are added together. All right, so now let's talk about sequential switches. So sequential switches are modules that do one of two things. They're either going to route several inputs to one outlet sequentially, or they're going to route one input to several outputs sequentially. And there's a few different ways that we can use this, but one of the most common is to chain sequences together. So we're going to do that here in VCV Rack. So I've got a sequence here that is playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And because Twinkle Twinkle Little Star is a long melody, it's got a couple different phrases in it, I can only get the first 8 notes in this sequence. So I can get Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but I can't do How I Wonder What You Are. I've got that on the second row. And it would be nice if this sequencer would allow me to play row 1 and then row 2, and then I could alternate between them, but I can't do that. And that's actually kind of uncommon on sequencers. This setup is pretty common. But what I can do is I can add a sequential switch, and there's one in the fundamentals collection here. I'm going to grab SS2. SS2 has several different inputs, a total of 4 inputs and 1 output. So what I'm going to do is send row 1 into one of its inputs and row 2 into the second input. And the way this works is it's got this switch where it can choose between 2 inputs, 3 inputs, or 4 inputs. And if it is on 2 inputs, it's going to alternate just between the first 2. If it's on 3, it'll alternate between the first 3, 4, through all 4. So the way this works is every time it gets a click, every time it gets a trigger into this clock input, it's going to switch outputs. And it's going to do that sequentially, hence sequential switch. So it's always going to go from this one to this one to this one to this one. So I'm going to set this to 2 inputs because that's all that I'm using right now. I'm going to send this output to my volts per octave. And now I'm going to have to find some way to change this at the end of each phrase. So I have to find a way to send a trigger in here that'll trigger this every 8 notes. So basically every time this phrase ends, it'll trigger to switch to the second input when this one starts. And there's one easy way we can do that, which is just to take this first gate here like we did before with the filter. We're going to send that in here. You can see whenever any phrase ends and the next one starts, the light here shows us that we're getting a trigger in here. And now we're alternating. We can do this even more. I've got a third sequence here that I've programmed with kind of a little complementary melody. We can add in a third sequence. And there's even a fourth input, and we don't have 4 outputs from this sequence, so we can only get a 24-step sequence with this sequencer, which is plenty for most purposes. But let's say I wanted to use all 4 inputs. I'm actually going to take my little counter melody, I'm going to move that down to the 4th input, and then I'm going to duplicate row 1. We're going to have basically an antecedent phrase coming from row 1, and then 2 consequent phrases coming from row 2, for those of you guys who know that terminology from music theory. Oh, and then because I'm using 4 inputs, I've got to switch this to 4 inputs up here. Here's the first phrase, second phrase, first phrase again, third phrase. So that's how we can use that sequential switch. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. We'll just go back to the first phrase. We're going to go kind of mad listening to Twinkle Twinkle. So I'm just going to bring this down to 4 steps. We're just going to ping pong between the C and the G there. And let's find a use for the other sequential switch. I'll go ahead and mute this while we do that. This is the sequential switch that has 1 input and multiple outputs. And there's a lot of different things we can do with this switch. One I'll show you right now, which is we can use it to create kind of a stereo ping pong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the input from my VCA, or the output I should say, from my VCA and send that in. And then I'm going to send the output to my output. And I'm going to pan this all the way to the left. And then I'm going to take a second output and pan that all the way to the right. And it already is panned there. And then I need to find a way to trigger this. And I want to trigger this for every note. So every note is jumping between the left speaker and the right speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and take this gate as my trigger, because this is going to trigger every single note. And I need to make sure that this is happening just 2 inputs. And so now you can hear that every note, this trigger is sent, and it's going to switch between these 2 outputs. And so that means every note that comes through here ends up passing through alternating outputs. And we get this stereo ping pong. Now, one thing you have to be careful about doing this is this sequential switch doesn't know when you're sending audio voltage through, or if you're sending triggers through, or volts per octave through. And if you're using audio information, you have to be careful, because when audio info is interrupted, you'll get these clicks. And if you listen, you can hear a click at the beginning and end of every note. And so you have to be judicious with your ADSR. For instance, if we gave a lot of release, like if we brought this up, you can hear that release is getting interrupted, and so we're hearing that click every time. And for some purposes, that click might not be bothersome to you. But if you want to get rid of it, what we can do is be judicious with our attack and decay. Give us enough attack time that we're avoiding a click at the beginning, enough decay time that we're ending the note before the decay at the end. We don't want to have any sustain, because sustain is going to make the note last for the full gate, and then it's going to get cut off. But if we do it like this, we can avoid any of those clicks. All right, so let's do something else, something a little more advanced with these sequential switches. So right now, I've got a sequence that's playing, moving through this VCA, going through a quantizer, and then through an oscillator and EG. And I'm going to add a sequential switch, but I'm going to add one from ML. They've got a fancy one here that has 8 inputs and 1 output. So I'm going to stop off at this sequential switch on my way out. And up here, I've got a sample and hold that is triggering random voltages, and that is sent into a VCA, which scales things down to the same range that my sequencer is scaled to. I'm going to send that to the other input, and I can alternate between the sequence and the random voltages. And because I'm using my quantizer after this switch, everything that comes through here is going to be quantized after the fact, which is a good signal path. That'll make things work well. So this little button lets us choose between things, but we can also send a gate into the up or down inputs here. And the up's going to make it scale up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're only using 2, so we'll jump this knob down to 2. And so this is alternating between a note in the sequence and a note from the random sample and hold. And if we go down, it'll go in the other direction, which if you only have 2, you can't really tell. But if you have more than 2, you can see that it's moving down. And there's also a random input, which will randomly switch. Now, again, when you just have 2, it's not making that big of a difference. So let's make some copies of our sequence so that we have a little more presence from the sequence and a little less presence from the random. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump this random down to 4, and I'm just going to send row 1 of my sequence to 2 and to 3. Oops, not directly from the sequence, but from the VCA. I've got to switch my knob to incorporate 4 inputs. And so now row 1 sounds just like my sequence. Row 2 sounds exactly the same, as does row 3. And then row 4, I should be saying input 4. Input 4 is my random sample and hold. And so I could take my first gate output, send that to up, And so we're going to get one repetition of the sequence, a second repetition, a third repetition, and then a little random sequence of 8 notes. So we get the sequence, and then we get this little treat. Another option that we could do, which is kind of cool, is to send this to the random input. So we're going to get random changes, but we're going to also send every single gate. And so what happens is we get our sequence moving steadily, because as we switch through 1, 2, and 3, it doesn't make a difference. We're going to hear our regular sequence. But then every now and then, a step of our sequence is going to be replaced with a random note from input 4. So that's kind of a cool way to vary your sequence, and we can add another variation here. These are all tricks I've picked up from one of those Omri Cohen videos. I'll post that online with the lesson so you guys can take a look at it, and he'll walk through some things in more detail. I'm just going to take this octave shifter, and before 3 moves into our sequencer, we're going to stop off at the octave shifter. And then we're going to have row 1, or input 1 is a regular sequence, input 2 is a regular sequence, input 3 is going to be a regular sequence that's 2 octaves higher, and then 4 is going to be a random note. So these are some interesting ways that you can take a repetitive sequence, which might be a little boring, and make it interesting by adding some variation. There's one more trick that I'll show you, which is going to require looking at a new sequencer. So here I've got 2 sequencers. I've got seq3, but I'm only using this as a clock, because this new sequencer I want to look at, which is from Bog Audio, it's called the ADDR sequencer, it does not have its own clock. So it's one of those sequencers that needs an external clock. So I'm using seq3 as my clock. And then I have this sequence. You notice that I'm going right from the sequencer to the quantizer. That's because this sequencer has kind of a cool feature. If you right-click on it, you can go down and choose some additional features. And if you go down to range, you can actually set the voltage range of the output. So if you have it on 0 to 10, that's a normal output range for a sequencer, and you'll get some really high pitches and really low pitches. But this can scale things down. So I've got it down to 0 to 1 volts, so every note that comes out of my sequencer is within the range of 1 octave. 0 to 3 would be 3 octaves, 0 to 5 would be 5 octaves, etc. So I'm just going to keep it down at 1 octave. So here are each of my steps. I've got the knobs kind of randomly turned, so I have this little sequence playing. Here is where I choose the number of steps, and right now I've got a 7-step sequence. So if you listen, you hear that there's 7 notes in the pattern. There's a forward and reverse switch, so we can have the sequence move backwards. Go back to forwards, and then here is the step that we select to be our first step. So if we wanted it to go from 2 through 8 instead of 1 through 7, we could start that on the second step, and now it'll move 2 through 8. So it's a handy, simple little sequencer that doesn't take up a lot of space in the rack. And so one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few different copies of this that are different lengths. So I'm going to add a, first let's add a sequential switch so we can switch between them. So I'm going to send this as input 1. We'll do 4 of them. Let's make a copy of this. I'm going to randomize the knobs so that we get a different pattern. I'm going to set this one to 5 steps. Start at the first knob, and then we'll send this as input 2. We'll send our switch out to the quantizer. Here's our second pattern. We need to send the clock into it so it has something to drive it. All right, let's add another sequence. We're going to randomize this one, set it to 4 steps, start on the first step, and then we'll send this to number 3. And we need a clock to drive this one. Let's go ahead and change the pitches so we get a different note with each step. We'll add one more. Randomize. We'll make this one just 3 notes long. I need a clock to drive it. And let's take a listen to this one. Start on the first step. So now we might want to change in between these, and we don't want to change every single note because then we won't notice any pattern at all. So if we take the gate 1 input from our sequence up here, that means every 8 steps it's going to change, and we'll just go to random. And so, but what's cool about this is that if we listen to 8 steps of a 7-step sequencer, we're going to hear 7 steps, and then the first one repeats. If we listen to 8 steps of a 5-step sequencer, we'll hear all 5, and then the first 3 will repeat. If we do a 4-step sequencer, we'll hear the whole sequence twice. If we do a 3-step sequencer, we'll hear the whole sequence twice and then 2/3 of the next time. So we're going to hear these like weird repetitions that keep getting interrupted as we switch between these different sequences every 8 counts. Let's take a listen. So that's one more way to kind of spice up your sequences and make them a little more interesting and add some variation, but not make them totally random, but make them where there's some patterns that are constantly changing. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is a clock divider. And to do that, I've got this patch pulled up here. And in this patch, I've got 3 oscillators that are each being handled totally separately. I've got an oscillator running through a VCA controlled by an EG. Each one of them has its own quantizer, but that quantizer is set to the same scale, to C minor. This middle voice here has a sequencer, one of those narrow ADDR sequencers, and it's sending a 4-foot voice to input 1. This second voice down here also has an ADDR sequence, but if you look at the knobs, you can see it's a different sequence, it's a different pattern. This one's sending an 8-foot voice, so an octave lower, to input 2. And then up here, I don't have a sequencer, but I've got a sample and hold that's being scaled by a VCA and then being quantized in the same way and sending a 1/2-foot voice, so a very high voice, into input 3. We're not hearing anything because there's no clock to drive any of these things, so nothing is causing these things to sound. And so I could add a clock and have them all run at the same time, but that would be kind of boring. We would hear all 3 oscillators changing notes together every time. So what if there was a way that we could have each of these voices moving at different speeds, but have those speeds synced up in a way that they related musically? So for that, we're going to use a clock divider. And the clock divider is a module that can generate several clocks, all with an arithmetic relationship to one another. So by that I mean, let's say our tempo is X. A clock divider can send a clock out at X BPM, so what our basic clock is. It can also send clocks out at multiples of that, so 2 times X, at twice the tempo, 4 times X, twice that tempo, or at divisions. In fact, hence the name clock divider. Usually they're sending divisions. So you can send another clock at half the tempo of X, or 1/4 the tempo of X, or 1/8, 1/16, etc. So to start with, I'm going to use kind of a cool clock divider, which comes from AS, which is this BPM clock. This BPM clock, there's a knob that lets us set our BPM. And then there's a couple knobs that let us set a time signature, which is kind of cool. It's also kind of unusual for clock dividers. So I'm going to leave this at 4/4 for now. And I'm going to take one of these outputs at the bottom. I'm going to grab the one that says beat, and I'm going to send that to the clock of this sequencer here. And then I'm going to take that same output and send it to the gate of my envelope generator here. And so this is producing a regular sequence here where we get a note on every beat of this measure. And then for the lower voice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this output that says bar. So we know there's in 4/4, there are 4 beats per bar. So that means every 4 notes on this sequence, we're going to get a note on this sequence. So I'm going to take this bar output, send that to the clock, and then take another copy of that and send it to the gate of that EG. So for every 4 notes on this sequence, we get 1 note on this sequence. And so now let's make our high random pitched pattern of notes be even faster. So we can take the 16ths here, send that to the trigger of the sample and hold, and then like before, we're going to send that to the gate of the ADSR. And so this voice is moving in 16th notes. So for every 1 note in this middle voice, we get 4 notes on our high voice. And so this BPM clock is cool because we can change the time signature. So let's do something in a very different time signature. I'm going to switch our high voice to 8th notes. And let's change this to 6/8 time. Those of you guys who know your time signatures know that, let's reset that. We can stop it, which is handy. So for 6/8 time, for every bar, we're going to have 6 eighth notes. And for every beat, there's going to be 3 eighth notes. Let's see how that sounds. So we've sort of seen a clock divider before. We haven't worked with it, but if you remember on the JW clock module, there were some outlets at the bottom that said divided by 4, divided by 8, divided by 16, and 32. And so those were clock divider outputs. So if you took your main output from that clock and you wanted something that was a little slower, you could use one of those bottom outlets from that clock module. But perhaps the most robust clock module is from Impromptu, which is why I asked you guys to subscribe to that collection of modules. This one is called Clocked. And in Clocked, you can set a main clock with 3 derivative clocks, with 3 clocks that derive from the main tempo of the main clock. And you can set some different parameters for each of those clocks. So in this patch, I'm going to take my main clock, which is whose output is up here. I'm going to send that into the clock of the sequence of my middle voice, and then also to the gate of our envelope generator there. And Clocked lets you adjust the tempo. And it also lets you adjust a couple other parameters. Here we've got swing, which will change the swing amount, which gives us an unequal pulse, a sort of triplet feel that you use a lot in jazz. So we have this little triplet feel. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can also increase the swing amount so it feels like a dotted 8th 16th pattern. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. So that's a handy tool to have. We can also change the pulse width of our gate. Remember, clocks can send triggers or gates. In this case, we're sending a gate. And if we make our pulse width narrower, the sustain time of our envelope will get shorter. If we pull all the way to the left, it's just the trigger. So we just get the attack and the release and no sustain time. And we can make the note longer by increasing the pulse width. All right, and so down here we've got our 3 other clock outputs, and then for each of those clocks we have some different controls. You see the swing, the pulse width, there's something called delay we'll look at in a sec. But the main one is this ratio here. So let's take our first clock. We're going to send that to the clock of our sequence, and then also to the gate of our envelope. And let's send our first clock. Right now they're synced together. So they're moving at the exact same tempo. Here I'm going to make this move in a ratio of 1/2. So now this one is moving half as fast as our middle voice, as our main clock. We can go even slower, go down to 1/4. So there's this other parameter we haven't talked about yet, delay. And to see delay, let's go ahead and sync them back up again. So they are starting together and moving together. And what delay does is delay creates an offset from the main clock. So right now they're at the same tempo and they're starting and changing each note at the exact same time. If we add this delay, we can create an offset. So right now they're a 16th note apart. So this one is delayed by a 16th note. We can move that up to an 8th note, which will make it more audible. So we have this kind of ping-ponging between the voices. They're in the same tempo still, but they're off by an 8th note. So that's another handy device there, handy parameter. Let's go ahead and go back to where we've got a 1/4 of the main clock. And let's take a second clock and we'll send that up to our random high voice. That's going to go into the sample and hold trigger and also to the envelope gate. And we'll make this one faster. Let's go to ×4. So now it's 4 times the regular clock. Another thing that's handy to do when you're working with a clock divider is to take the reset output and send that to all the resets of the sequencers. So that way, if you want to start your sequencers together at any point, we can stop by hitting the run button. If you want to reset them, you can hit this reset button, and all the sequencers are going to reset together. And so now when we hit run, they're all starting together on their first step. So this is working pretty well, but you'll notice that all these voices are always attacking every single note. And when we were working with the Seq3 sequencer, we could turn some of those gates off and get some interesting rhythms. And we can still do that here, but we need to pull up that modulator again. So let's go ahead and grab the Seq3 sequencer. And let's say I want my high voice up here not to be playing constant 16th notes, but to have some kind of a quirky rhythm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sync the clock of Seq3 to my main clock from clocked. So I'm going to take this clock output, send that up to my external clock up here. So now these two are in sync with each other. And now I'm going to create an interesting pattern here with my notes. Let's go with something like this. And now I'm going to take the gate. Now I'm going to take the gate from this envelope generator, and instead of that coming from the clock 2 output here, I'm going to have that come from the gate of this sequencer. And you notice that we're hearing 2 notes for every step here, and that's because I did something wrong. Instead of having this external clock synced to our main clock, we should have had that synced to the clock that we were using before. And now that sounds like what I was hoping. So now we're still getting a new voltage sampled every time this fast clock is triggered. So we're still getting some really fast notes, except we're only hearing the notes that are triggered by this sequencer, and we are using this because we want to get this cool little rhythm where we can turn some gates off. We can change that rhythm by turning some different gates on. So if you like working with clocked, but you think it's too big, it takes up too much space, there is a second version of clocked that is a little more compact. It's called Klukt. It just lacks the swing and pulse width knobs, but it's got all the other same features, a main clock and then 3 derivative clocks. One other thing that I'll show you that clock sequencers, that clock dividers can do that's kind of handy is using them to create sub-octave pulse waves. Now, not all clock dividers in VCV-Rack do this equally well, but in the modular synth world, this is something that a lot of people use clock dividers for. So if you remember, a clock is basically a series of gates or a series of triggers, so it's effectively a series of pulse waves. And if pulse waves can be divided and slowed down or sped up, then we can use a clock divider to actually tune an audio pulse wave. So to do that, I'm going to grab a clock divider from Autodafe, which looks like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pulse wave from my main voice here and send that into my clock divider. And the clock divider isn't smart enough to know that this is an audio pulse wave and not a clock pulse wave. It just says pulse waves or pulse waves or pulse waves. So it just sees this as a really, really fast pulse wave, a pulse wave that's moving, 440 times per second. And so then there's all these outputs. And if I were to take the divided by 2 output, I'm going to divide the frequency of that clock by 2, and I'm going to get a pitch that's an octave lower. Divided by 4, I'll get a pitch 2 octaves lower, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to hear that, but I want to run it through the same envelope generator as my main voice. So to do that, I'm going to grab one of those UMix modules that we talked about early in the lesson. So we're going to send our triangle wave that we're using as our main voice into the UMix, and then the output is going to go into the VCA. And then we're also going to take the clock divided pulse wave. We're going to take the divided by 2 output and send that in. Let's go ahead and turn things on before we do that. So there's our triangle wave. And then we can take the divided by 2. So we now have the same pattern of pitches that's coming from our sequencer, but now it's an octave lower. And if we do this with divided by 4, get the same thing an octave lower than that. And even an octave lower still. And then we're starting to push it where you can't really tell what the pitch is. But a lot of people who work with synthesizers like to generate these sub-oscillators that do everything an octave lower. And this is a really easy, efficient way to do that. But again, some clock dividers don't do that well. Clocked gets a little finicky if you send really fast pulse waves into it. So does the BPM clock. This is one of the ones that I found that works the cleanest. All right, so here we are back in our main patch that we were using a second ago. We've got 3 voices moving at 3 different speeds. And if you're like me, you think it sounds okay, but this top voice is a little annoying. Like, it's just constantly going. It's kind of making me anxious. It's too fast, too much. So what if I wanted to, I wish there was a way that I could make this a top voice, maybe play a few notes and then stop, and then play another burst of fast notes and then stop. So I'm not getting constant fast notes, I'm just getting them in little bursts. And there is a module we can use to get that, and it's called a burst generator. And a burst generator is a clock which does not create a constant metronome, but instead generates a fixed burst of triggers. So it might send a group of 4 triggers and then stop, or a group of 8 triggers and then stop. And there's one handy burst generator, which is from Repelsin, which is the Repelsin Reburst. And let's go ahead and open that and add it to our patch. So here I've got the Repelsin Reburst. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send my fast clock, which is triggering my sample and hold. I'm going to send that as the clock input of Reburst. And so now whenever Reburst sends outputs, it's going to send them at that same clock speed. And then down here is Reburst's output. It's got a switch where it can send gates or triggers. I'm just going to leave it on gates. And instead of the gate to my ADSR coming from my clock and outputting constantly, I'm going to send the output from Reburst instead. And so now there's this button up here on Reburst, and anytime I click that button, it's going to send a burst of clicks and then stop. And well, how many clicks? Well, that's determined by this repetitions knob. So it'll send one click and then however many repetitions we get from this knob here. Right now it's set to 4, which would be a total of 5, 1 with 4 repetitions. So let's move this up to 7. So we'll get a total of 8 notes, one first note and then 7 repetitions. So every time I click this, I'm going to get a burst of 8 notes. So that's kind of cool. We can have just control over when that top voice comes in. I can change the number of repetitions. If I just want a burst of 4 notes, I'll move that knob down to 3. All right, let's move that back up to 7. And I keep having to click this, and sometimes I don't click it right at the exact moment. I get those little hiccups. So instead of me relying on me to click this, I'm going to set the third clock output down here to a slow tempo. Let's go to divided by 8. So every 8 notes here, we're going to get 1 output from this clock. And I'm going to take my third clock output, and I'm going to send that to this burst input. So I get every 8 notes on this middle voice, I get a burst of 8 fast notes on this top voice. Some other features of reburst is it's got this accel knob, which will cause the bursts to accelerate as they progress. Which is pretty useful, but it doesn't really sound great in this patch right now. And it's also got this jitter knob, which will randomize when the triggers actually happen. So right now they're happening at a steady pace, but if we increase this jitter knob, you can hear this better if we slow things down. You can hear they're not happening steadily. There's kind of a herky-jerky movement to them. And the other thing that's useful if you want to chain together a series of events is down here at the bottom, there's this EOC output. That stands for end of cycle. So at the end of the bursts, it'll send a trigger out here to say, hey, whatever we just did, we've just finished. And we can use this for a number of different things. Right now, what I'm going to use it for is to create a loop. So I'm going to send the end of cycle into the input here. Turn the jitter back down to 0. So now when I click the burst, it's not going to stop because every time it does 8, it sends an end of cycle signal back into the beginning. And so now it's creating a loop. And that kind of defeats the point of the burst for this patch because the whole reason I wanted the burst was so that I wouldn't have this constant looping. But that just demonstrates that feature and shows us something cool we can do, which is, let's say I wanted my main clock to be kind of jerky. I don't want to have just a steady clock. I want things to be kind of jittery. What I can do then is I'm going to get rid of this sync here. I'm going to go ahead and send the gate for my high voice back from my main clock. And I'm just going to use reburst as a way to sync this main clock. So I'm going to take its output here and send it into the BPM of clocked. And you have to be a little careful. This BPM input can take several different kinds. It can take control voltage, or it can listen and count pulse waves. So I'm going to set my mode. If it's on control voltage, it's going to be acting like it wants to be modulated by a LFO or something. But if I go down to pulse and then there's a number, it's going to just say, it's going to create a clock beat for every certain number of pulses. So if we send it down to pulse 2, that means every 2 triggers from reburst is going to make 1 clock tick in clocked. And so what I'm going to do is now I'm using reburst to drive clocked. And right now it's moving at 78 BPM. We can take a listen to how that sounds. We can use this time knob to change the tempo. And this doesn't sound any different than anything we've been doing before. This is really inefficient because clocked has its own built-in clock, so why would we do this? Well, one reason is this jitter knob. So what we can do is we're driving clocked with this reburst, but reburst has this little random function, so if we bring up this jitter knob, we get our main clock that's driving everything keeps kind of changing its tempo. It kind of has this jerky, not steady pattern to it. So if you're interested in these kind of jerky rhythms, this is a useful tool to have. So those are some ways that you can use reburst. Reburst also is able to send out a control voltage based on some different patterns. I'm not going to go over that now, but I'll include a link to an Omri Cohen video where he goes over some of that stuff. All right, so here is the last patch that we're going to look at today. It's a variation of the one that we've been looking at. I've got the same two voices down here that are driven by clocked. I've got a middle voice and a lower voice that's moving at half the speed. And then I've got a high random voice, and it's basically the exact same before. It's moving in 16th notes, and it's a higher voice moving through sample and hold, so it's generating random pitches, but it's moving through this wave shaper, and it's only coming out the left speaker. Then on top of that, I've added an additional voice that's controlled by playing the same pitches from the same sample and hold. You can see the output from that quantizer is going up to the input here. It's also running through a wave shaper, except it's doing so with different features. So the timbre is going to be different, and this one's only coming out the right speaker. And it would be cool if this patch, right now it sounds kind of boring and it's pointless, like why would we have two of those? But it'd be kind of cool if we could alternate from one of those voices to the other and get this kind of ping pong between the speakers. It would also be nice if instead of doing that in a regular sequential switch kind of way where we hear left, right, left, right, left, right, that there could be some kind of random pattern that would drive that. And to do that, we're going to use a Bernoulli gate, which is a handy little module. There's a few different makers that make these modules, but the most well-known one is from Audible Instruments. And this is called a Bernoulli gate. It's named after Jacob Bernoulli, who was a 17th century Swiss mathematician who studied probability. And there's a few features of randomness and repeated events in statistics that are named for Bernoulli because he conducted some of these early statistical experiments. So a Bernoulli gate takes a trigger input and it routes it to one of two outputs according to a random coin toss. So basically, every time Bernoulli gate gets something sent into its input, gets a clock sent to its input, it's going to randomly send it out either A or B. And it's effectively like it's just tossing a coin. Heads, it comes out output A. Tails, it comes out output B. So let's go ahead and set this up so that it's alternating between this high random voice and this high random voice. So we're going to keep our fast clock changing sample and hold really quickly. That's going to be normal. But instead of our gates for our envelope generators coming from clocked, we're going to send those are going to come from the Bernoulli gate. So I'm going to take my other one here, and that's going to come from output A. And then we're going to just go ahead and send our main clock, or our fast clock, I should say, into the input here. And so now it's alternating randomly between output A and B, and if we unmute, we'll hear that ping pong between the left and right speaker. And here in the middle, we've got this probability knob. And what the probability knob controls is the likelihood that it's going to come out A or B. Right now, each are equally likely. If we move this probability knob all the way to the left, it's only going to come out output A. All the way to the right, only output B. And so if we're in the middle, each are equally likely. And if we're sort of not all the way to the left, but closer to the left than the right, it's going to come out output A more often, but it's still going to be random. And likewise on the other side. And And there's actually two modes of the Bernoulli gate. This is what happens in what's called latch mode. And you change modes by hitting this button. But if you want to know which mode you're in, you can just right-click on the module, and it'll show you channel 1 is in latch, channel 2 is also in latch. And I forgot to mention, but down here, the Bernoulli gate is really simple. It just has this input and these two outputs and a probability knob. So because it doesn't take up much space, they just added a second one here for you. So you can have two Bernoulli gates in one module. So right now we're in latch mode. If we switch that to toggle mode, and I clicked that button, and if you right click now it says channel 1 is in toggle, then it's not going to change, this probability knob is not going to change the likelihood of output A versus output B. It's going to change the likelihood between repetition and change. So if we go all the way to the left, it's going to emphasize repetition. So whichever output it's sending, which right now is A, if we're all the way to the left, it's going to always send out A. If I happen to move this down to the left when it was coming out B, it would have been only coming out output B. If I move it all the way to the right, it's going to emphasize change. And so all the way to the right, it's going to always change, and we're going to get this perfect either-or ping pong. It's not random anymore. It's just A, B, A, B, A, B. So this is a much cleaner way to get that stereo ping pong we were looking at earlier with the sequential switch, where before we had to be all careful with the release time so we didn't get those clicks. Here we could increase the release time all we want. I mean, we're not going to get any clicks, and there's nothing to worry about there. But let's say we don't want this perfect A-B ping pong. We can move it back to the middle, and each are going to be equally likely, but it's still going to be random. So I'm going to include a link to a Bernoulli gate tutorial where they talk about actually using the Bernoulli gate to send audio signal information, which is something else that's kind of cool. We won't go into that for our purposes today, but that's how you use a Bernoulli gate in a patch like this. So that's all I wanted to get through today. So we talked about a lot of miscellaneous subjects related to sequencers today. We talked about cleaning up our arpeggiator so that whenever we change a note on the keyboard, it locks in with the changes in the sequencer and we don't get those hiccups or skips. We talked about ways to combine signals using simple mixing modules so that we can send multiple signals to the same destination. We talked about sequential switches and clock dividers, which are two really useful tools when you're working with sequencers. The two big takeaways from this lesson should be sequential switches and clock dividers. Those are the most important things we covered. But then we also covered bursts, which is a module that allows you to send just a scatter shot of triggers, and Bernoulli gates, which allow us a little bit of random selection as we're working with clocks. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll post the next assignment at the end of this week. And next week, we'll talk about synthesizing percussion sounds. Thanks.